As humans, we are united by the experience of death. Everyone at some point will experience the death of a close loved one. Our ideas about death and what comes after influence aspects of our daily lives, including fear of our immortality, experiences of grief and mourning, and the funeral rituals we take part in. The basic medical definition of death is the irreversible cessation of all circulatory and respiratory systems, or of all functions of the entire brain, including the cortex and brainstem. The definition of death is generally the same across all cultures. However, our understanding of the social practices involved before, during, and after one dies change across time and across different social cultural environments. In India, for example, Hinduism envisions death as a precursor to a new life. Once one is dead, they can be reborn into a new identity. This circular pattern of life allows for multiple deaths across multiple life planes. On the other hand, the Christian tradition views death as the ultimate end to the physical being, in which one's soul can continue into heaven. Other perceptions of death express the coexistence of the dead with the living and the influence that they may have. Buddhists believe that the spirits of their ancestors have the ability to protect the well-being of the living. Our conception of death has a profound impact on our daily life, our understanding of life and death, and our fear of death and dying and expressions of grief. Our understanding of death is highly individual, however perceptions are shared within different cultural contexts, creating cultural differences in the perception of a desirable death. However death is defined, each culture has beliefs of how death should occur. These beliefs constitute the notion of a good death. Some components of a good death are consistent across cultures. A good death allows the family time to prepare for life without the dying. This is a time for personal preparation, to complete any unfinished tasks and say farewell to loved ones. This definition does not allow for sudden or premature death. Classifications of socially acceptable behaviour of the bereaved vary significantly in different countries and cultural contexts. It seems most widely accepted that one is to mourn for a reasonable time period, consisting of weeping and lack of motivation for social exploits. However, in other parts of the globe, it is more widely accepted to wear white or celebrate the deceased with a lively display or event. The confines of one singular description would be too narrow to account for the variations between cultures. Therefore, definitions of socially appropriate death must be explored between different cultural contexts. Death and dying embody a sense of fear for many in contemporary Western societies. The central authority when facing death is the self, as an individual being. The rise of the Christian belief system led to the separation of the body and the soul. Individuals began to define a good death as the absence of sin and preparations being made for the transition to heaven. The rise of life-preserving medical technology made the fear of death more salient, and the concept of the good death shifted to encompass the absence of pain and length of life as paramount to the definition. The Western definition of a good death includes informed decision-making. Individuals are responsible for giving consent and making decisions about their life and treatment possibilities. Responsibility is placed on the individual rather than on the family. Conversely, in Asian traditions, disclosing an undesirable prognosis can appear to be inviting death and disrespecting the patient and their family. Additionally, responsibility for decision-making, such as removal of life-sustaining treatment, is placed on the physician. Decisions regarding end-of-life care that ultimately lead to death are seen as the physician's fault rather than that of the underlying illness, leading to the perception that one has not had a good death.
From here, we will look at an example from a study done by Wong Kim and Berg that look into end-of-life care for Asians living in America. The discussion that follows includes the challenges experienced by immigrant patients and their families in an attempt to practice cultural beliefs of good death, which are in conflict with the local policy and procedures for end-of-life care. It also discusses the strategies used by healthcare workers to support the patients and their families in their beliefs during the patient's last moments. This puts into perspective that the concept of good death is not a one-size-fits-all. Mrs. Yi, an elderly Chinese immigrant woman diagnosed with end-stage lung cancer, was being considered by her family for a transfer to hospice care in a nursing home. Interpreters were made available for the physician to communicate with Mrs. Yi and her families on matters such as do not resuscitate order for hospice care, the patient's prognosis with the possibility of death in few months or weeks' time. When Mrs. Yi suffered cardiac arrest, she was put in an intensive care unit with life support system to sustain her life. With the failure of both her lungs and liver due to spread of cancer, the intensive care unit team proceeded to discuss with Mrs. Yi's family that they are required to decide on withdrawal of the life support system on Mrs. Yi, which was artificially sustaining her life. 2 weeks later, after intense counseling and reassurance, Mrs. Yi's family gave consent to withdraw Mrs. Yi's life support, and she died 3 hours later. The social worker had been informed by Mrs. Yi's husband and son that they felt the healthcare team had unethically handled the case and that Mrs. Yi suffered a tragic death. It was reported in the study that Mrs. Yi's husband and son has responded angrily when the issue of do not resuscitate was brought up, and that Mrs. Yi's son has responded, "I cannot tell you to kill my mother," when he was approached on the matter on withdrawal of life support. Mrs. Yi's family had believed that the decision of the healthcare team to inform Mrs. Yi of a poor prognosis has resulted in her giving up on the will to live, and discussing death in the presence of Mrs. Yi has invited an evil spirit that took over her body. Mrs. Yi's husband and son felt it was their responsibility to protect Mrs. Yi and that they had been prevented to fulfill this role. While from Mrs. Yi's healthcare team's view, the family has been unreasonable and uncooperative in facilitating open discussion, which resulted in their reserved attempts to provide comfort care to the patient and assisting her for a peaceful death. On reflection, we realize the difficulties faced by immigrant patients and their families and healthcare workers on death and dying matters will result from end-of-life care local policy and environment that may be lacking in understanding and support of others' cultural beliefs. The meaning of a good death by a healthcare worker who is conditioned with local beliefs may be different from those of patients and their families of varying backgrounds and cultures. When policy and procedures do not promote cultural sensitivity within the healthcare system, the little respect and understanding of others' culture may cause insensible approach by healthcare workers. This becomes a barrier in providing effective and satisfactory end-of-life care support to patients and their families, which originally meant for supporting the needs of those going through their toughest moments in facing death and dying matters. Hence, we feel it is necessary to have healthcare policy and procedures that take cultural context into account, fostering an environment of cultural understanding and appreciation among the workforce through education and training. This encourages the healthcare workers to be more willing in adopting flexibility in adjusting their way of working along with the expectation of patients and their families. One such strategy discussed in the study by Wong Kim and Burke was the common practice of healthcare workers in Japan to perform non-essential CPR on dying patients to provide more time for the patient's family to arrive at the hospital, to be present with the patient during the last moments. This is a result of embracing the belief that the sharing of the dying process constitutes to a good death. Another approach by healthcare workers in Japan was to create a soft landing scenario through the minimization of huge and immediate changes upon the dying process to allow a more gradual flow as a form of support to the families for a less impactful experience. Such consideration by healthcare workers enables both the patients and the families for an experience of a coordinated and culturally appropriate end-of-life care support. Ultimately, this promotes higher values of empathy and compassion within the healthcare workforce.
Those working in the healthcare field that care for terminally ill patients should attempt to acknowledge the wider concepts of a good death. Specifically, practitioners need to understand and be provided with further training on what different cultures consider to be a good death, to ensure that everyone, regardless of culture, experiences what they believe to be a good death. This will enable practitioners to explore the relative importance of the domains of what patients consider to be a good death, which allows them to tailor the circumstances for each patient to ensure that that patient has a good death. Now, taking everything you have learned throughout the video today, think about how what you believe to be a good death is different to that of someone else you know. Can you think of a time when you noticed this? If so, how different were these views to yours?
We have come to and please hit the like button if you think you have learned something today.